Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our third public meeting on the Regional Rail Master Plan, known as Reimagining Regional Rail here at SEPTA. So we have the next slide, Christoph. We'll jump into the agenda for tonight. So we'll give a brief project overview as a reminder for what we're trying to accomplish with this project as we move forward. Provide a recap of some of the highlights from what we learned during phase one and all of the outreach that we had across the fall and winter over the past several months. Recap some of the lessons that we learned by looking at the existing conditions and the state of the current system on regional rail and other SEPTA services, and highlight what we learned through that process. We'll take a brief break for a Q&A through that at that time point, and then we'll launch into the proposed scenarios and the evaluation that we've run those through. So we get an idea of what could be accomplished based on the state of the system and all the lessons we learned through the outreach to this point. And then we'll wrap up with some of the other choices and next steps focused on implementation before taking another round of questions. The next slide. Throughout the evening, there's a couple of different ways you can interact with this process. There will be a couple of live polls that we'll launch during this to keep everybody involved as we move forward. And then finally, the typical Q&A box. You should see an icon at the bottom of your tray. You can type in your questions and we'll answer those either live back through the chat, or when we take those Q&A breaks, we'll point them to the right team member. The next slide. So I'm Ryan Judge. I'm the Director of Strategic Planning and Analysis here at SEPTA. We have a number of other people from the SEPTA team on the call tonight, including Jody Holton, who's the Assistant General Manager for Planning and Strategy, and Claudia Leaf, who's a Planning Analyst in Strategic Planning as well. On the next slide. As a reminder, this project fits in with SEPTA Forward, our strategic plan, and part of our efforts to create a lifestyle transit network that serves all types of trips, not just the typical 9-to-5 commute patterns that we so often see across our region. It's working in tandem with other projects that are ongoing, including Project Metro, which is looking at the rebranding of the rail transit network and unifying those services to serve better trips. And then Bus Revolution, which is looking at a wholesale redesign of our entire bus network to serve different commute patterns across our region. The next slide, I'll hand it off to Christoph Spieler to introduce the consultant team that we have on board before he walks through some of the recap of lessons learned. Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm Christoph Spieler at Hewitt-Zollars. I'm the consultant project manager for this project. And we have a great consultant team on this project, including Nelson Nygaard working with us on planning, Connect the Dots and portfolio associates who are doing public outreach. And as we get further into the project, another whole team of technical consultants will help us figure out implementation. And you'll hear from multiple members of this team as we present the project today. So to start with, we know that the regional rail system works well for many riders. Over 132,000 people rode regional rail daily before the pandemic. But we also feel like the system does not serve as many trips as it could, that it leaves people behind for many different reasons. And that fits into the overall discussion of SEPTA Forward. SEPTA Forward positions this idea of a lifestyle network, frequent all day, all week services that connect people to a range of destinations across the system and serve a whole variety of different kinds of trips. And we think regional rail is part of that network. And that's what this project is about, thinking about how to make regional rail more useful to more people as part of the SEPTA lifestyle network. And this project is only one part of that. Simultaneously, SEPTA is doing Bus Revolution, looking at redesigning the entire bus network. The two project teams are working together because we believe bus can feed into rail, rail can connect to bus, both systems can strengthen each other, and both can be part of that same lifestyle network. Reimagining Regional Rail is working towards a vision of what that looks like. And our job is to identify the infrastructure, the equipment, the operations, and the policies we need to get there. We're about halfway through that process right now. In stage one, we looked at existing conditions and did a phase of outreach to set goals. Based on that, we've now developed scenarios that meet those goals in different ways. And in this phase of outreach, we are coming to you and asking you which of those possible futures for regional rail works best for the region as we balance those choices and those trade-offs. Based on what we hear in this round of outreach over this month and next month, we'll select one scenario and develop that and then come back to you this fall with a vision for the future of regional rail. So far, we have done a public survey in round one, over 5,000 responses. We held 7 pop-up events all over the network with our little cart that we lugged up and down the stairs and on and off the trains. We held a virtual public meeting. We analyzed and documented existing conditions. We had multiple meetings of a planning advisory committee, multiple meetings of a stakeholder committee, focus groups, and now we have created and evaluated scenarios. All of that was built on our state of the system, and Susie will tell you about what we learned there.
Thanks, Christoph. So today the regional rail system is designed for commuters who work 9-to-5 jobs in Center City who usually live outside of the city of Philadelphia. This means that riders of regional rail today are disproportionately white, wealthy, male, and from households without a car, especially as compared to bus riders. Due to fare costs, service design, and preconceptions about who regional rail is for, low-income, minority residents within the city of Philadelphia usually opt for riding buses in SEPTA Metro, even when regional rail might be a faster, more direct way to get where they are going. Next slide. Although the regional rail system operates from early morning until late at night, infrequent service outside of rush hour does not allow for spontaneous travel or using the system for different types of trips throughout the day other than commuting. Most of the city of Philadelphia has demand for frequent all-day transit service, and the region as a whole has many major destinations outside of Center City along regional rail lines. To redesign the system, major investments will be needed in capital improvements, fleet changes, and how SEPTA staff operate the service. I'll hand it off to Teresa.
Thanks, Susie. So the work we've done so far has also benefited from what we've heard from all of you, those who ride regional rail and those who do not. Last fall, we opened a survey and we were able to learn a lot from the results. As Christoph mentioned, more than 5,000 people submitted a survey, and many of these people know the system fairly well through riding it. Most respondents live in the regional rail service area and work within it too. We also saw that our survey responses were skewing white, high-income choice riders, consistent with current ridership, who are relatively young. That's helpful, but it's not inclusive. And so we wanted to make sure that we were hearing from non-riders as well. So we hosted a series of focus group conversations. These focus group conversations allowed us to have more in-depth conversations to find out what are the barriers to riding regional rail today and how through this process we can begin to overcome them so the system is more inclusive. And here's some of what we heard. We heard that safety and cleanliness are key concerns for SEPTA riders. And we heard that regional rail is seen as having lower overall travel times. However, when people have options about which mode of transportation to take, their decisions are based more on cost and convenience. And the different fare structures between regional rail and the rest of the SEPTA system is not clear. Finally, there is a perception that regional rail ridership is more affluent and white. Next slide. And this leads us to how we have been able to use the findings that you all shared with us during the last round of outreach, because through this, we're able to test the challenges that we've identified around fare affordability and system integration and schedules. You'll see that we took your feedback to heart when it comes to the scenarios that we have developed. And here's an example from the survey. Something that we heard in the focus group sessions too, that frequency and integrated, accessible, affordable, and connected regional rail was listed as being the most important thing for the future of regional rail, with frequency rising to the top of the needs. And another thing that we flagged through the outreach is how different people experience the system. This slide shows an example of that. Men and women view station access differently. These charts show that men are way more likely to view station access as somewhat or very easy than women. And women are more likely to perceive stations as very hard to access than men. These kinds of differences are important to our team to pay attention to as we develop and as we evaluate the scenarios.
And with the information we learned from the first round of outreach and the existing condition state of the system research, we developed goals and objectives. These goals are meant to set the vision for the future of regional rail while providing a framework for things that we can accomplish in the near term as well. In an effort to maintain legibility in our work, we narrowed and clustered a long list of potential goals into 3. Each is focused on the rider experience and sets the stage for how we want regional rail to serve people. They guided the development of our scenarios. In order to increase and improve access to opportunity, we focused on connecting riders to where they want to go when they want to get there, making regional rail affordable and useful, and operating service that's competitive with driving. To prioritize an intuitive rider experience, we aim to better integrate regional rail into the SEPTA system, increase the walk and bike ability to stations, and go beyond minimum accessibility requirements. In creating reliable, predictable regional rail that people can trust, we aim to increase reliability, make service easy to understand, and offer frequent service where demand justifies it. There are many things we know we need to consider regardless of the scenario chosen. These are elements that we don't see as trade-offs between scenarios, but rather things that will be developed in tandem to the scenarios and feed into our final recommendation for regional rail. We think it's necessary to consider the implications of and vulnerabilities caused by climate change when building new infrastructure, ensure a legible and safe experience accessing the train, explore partnerships with other agencies, prioritize the needs who have not traditionally been served well by regional rail, encourage equitable and walkable development, and to value and support the frontline workers of SEPTA. So in every scenario, we address the feedback that we've heard about regional rail. We want to create a regional rail system that is easier to understand, easier to access, better connected, and more reliable. So we heard that regional rail can be confusing. It doesn't always come when you expect it, and it might not come often enough. To make the system easier to understand, each of our scenarios would have schedules where the train would leave at the same time every hour. So it's easier to remember when your train would arrive and depart from a given station. Local trains will all stop at every station, and express trains will always have the same patterns. So you'll know if it's an express train that it will make the same stops every time. Along with SEPTA Metro's wayfinding master plan, the regional rail stations would also get additional wayfinding, so it's easier for you to find your way.
We hear the regional rail is difficult to access. Some stations are simply difficult to get to, requiring you to climb flights of stairs or having low-level platforms that mean you have to climb steps to get onto the train. Impossible for riders using mobility devices, and also hard for riders with strollers or even bags of groceries. We can address this through investments in station accessibility, through how riders access station platforms, the height of the platforms, and through things like wayfinding and ticket vending machines that make the regional rail riding experience more intuitive and comfortable overall. And zooming out from the station, regional rail has often been thought of as drive and park, but we're looking at how to make the system easier to access by bike or on foot through better sidewalks and crosswalks, better connections to the bike network, and bike storage options at stations.
We heard that regional rail doesn't connect to the rest of SEPTA. When we looked at the data, there were very few people transferring from either SEPTA Metro or the bus onto regional rail. We want to create a system where more bus routes run to regional rail stations, and regional rail isn't thought of as a separate service, but as one lifestyle network where transfers and connections between modes are simple and easy. There's also new connections to SEPTA Metro that we'd like to make more streamlined and create a frequent network for all types of users. Fares also play a major role in connecting between modes. Right now, fares aren't integrated, and we envision a world where SEPTA bus riders can easily tap their card to move from bus to rail to metro.
We've also heard that regional rail delays can make it hard to plan your trips and hard to rely on the network. So we know we need to make this system more reliable. That includes new trains, because as Ryan often points out, we're still operating trains from the Nixon era. So modern trains would definitely make for more reliable service, but it also includes infrastructure upgrades, like track upgrades at key junctions to prevent one train from delaying another. And with that, we have the chance for our first Q&A break.
We actually don't have any yet right now, so we'll jump right into this poll, which just popped up on the screen. Check all of the ones that apply for whether this is your first public meeting or if you've already been to a few and provided feedback on that, and we'll see what the results come in at that. This helps us get an idea of who's participating throughout the process. All right, Madeline, do we have enough participation so far?
We're still going. 1 second.
All right.
It's stalling out. Okay, I'm going to end it. And would you like me to share the results?
Yeah, might as well. We got a good chunk of people showing up for their first meeting. They've provided feedback as well, so we appreciate that. And we'll send out the link as we go through this process so that everyone has easy access to that as we move forward as well. And then please help share all of the opportunities to get involved as we look forward over the next couple of weeks of a few pop-up events and open houses to share more information.
I do see we have a question Q&A now.
All right, so we have a question about the cost of ticket vending machines at stations. Yeah, that is something we're looking at, is what the cost for ticket vending machines are and the implications for providing them at more stations. We know that providing service and the level of service that we're looking to provide with this requires some upgrades to stations as we move forward, and making the ability to pay your fare more seamless and integrated with planning your trip and getting on your trip as we move forward is an important part of this. So that is something we're looking at right now. And Christoph, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that's right. I think by making buying fares easier, I think is an important part of this.
Okay, there's a couple other questions about some of the scenarios. I don't know if we want to move on and jump into those.
Yeah,
and there's some questions about the coordination for biking and walking infrastructure to connect to the regional rail system. I think that's really related to what we just talked about. And we're trying to go through this process in a way that really works with our partners to address those sorts of things. One of the things that we learned in the State of the System report that doesn't show up in some of the slides we have here today is when we look at our peers across the country and particularly internationally, what drives a lot of their ridership is the way that the communities develop in a very transit supportive way that promotes lifestyles that are supportive of walking and biking around stations and land uses that truly support that. So SEPTA put out a transit supportive community development policy last fall, and we're looking at ways to strengthen that and build on our efforts to truly advocate for that sort of land use and work with our partners to deliver that as we move forward.
Okay. I see. Yeah, there are a number of questions which address the scenarios. So I think it's a good time to go through the scenarios, and then we can pick up those questions afterwards. So public input guided the development of 3 scenarios, and these are really intended to set up choices. These are intended to create a discussion about different visions of the future. All of these are long-term visions, and all of these would be phased in over time. All 3 of them deploy the same amount of total service in different ways to illustrate trade-offs. So these all represent roughly the same operating cost deployed in different ways so that we can really see the kind of choices we have. And The final plan may well be a combination of all three of these, because it turns out these different approaches might make sense in different parts of the system. So to set up that choice, imagine a regional rail system that prioritizes coverage, or one that prioritizes frequency, or one that prioritizes speed. These kinds of choices have real implications for all of the people who ride this system and make the system useful for different kinds of trips. And you'll see these personas repeatedly through this presentation. We have people like a rush hour commuter from the outer suburbs, or somebody who's commuting but not for a 9-to-5 shift, or somebody who depends on transit for all of their trips and isn't just focused on work trips. These scenarios mean very different things to all of them. So the three scenarios that we have here are scenario 1, regional coverage, which is about 30-minute all-day service everywhere. Scenario 2, metro frequency, which is about high-frequency service where demand is highest. And scenario 3, all-day speed, which is about all-day express service that is better integrated with Amtrak. So let's start with scenario 1. Imagine you're in Doylestown and you need to go to a meeting in Center City. The train that's in front of you right now is going to get you there 55 minutes early. So you've ended up having to take extra time in your day, but you also know that if you waited for the next train, you would have been 5 minutes late to that meeting. This is the way a lot of this system is today. We have large parts of the system where hourly service is typical for most of the day, which makes it a lot harder for people to rely on the system. So in scenario 1, we spread that frequency across the entire system and go to 30-minute service both ways all day consistently across the entire network. What that results in is one segment from Glenside as far as Penn Medicine, which does have 15-minute service all day, but the rest of the system is a train every 30 minutes, in addition to express trains at rush hour. Trade-offs, though. It doesn't focus on offering frequent service. There's not a lot of that on this map. And it doesn't operate off-peak express service. So those fast express runs are only happening during rush hour. The way that works is local service is consistent and the same all day. It is simply trains that make every stop all the way to Center City. Express service operates at rush hour and stops only at express stations for faster trips, but it does not run outside of rush hour. Scenario 1 also better integrates fares and transfers between modes. Things like if you ride a bus to regional rail, you'll be credited for your bus fare as you board the regional rail train. So let's think about what this means for our personas. Brenda's trips get a little easier. Instead of a train once an hour, she has a train every 30 minutes. She still has to plan her trips around the train schedule, but she'll find a train that's reasonably convenient to make a lot of those trips. Further out, Fred has express service that gets him to Center City quickly. So as a suburban 9-to-5 commuter, he's quite happy with this system. Isabella, on the other hand, is not commuting at peak hour and is not going to Center City. So she has a train every 30 minutes, but that train makes every stop on the way to Center City. So her trip is slower than Fred's. So you can see how this scenario has very different implications for different people. And with that, let's move on to scenario number 2.
Yeah, so now imagine you're at Wissahickon and you're heading to Center City. You're taking the bus, you always do. However, regional rail is a few blocks away, not that nice of a walk to get there, but it's a much quicker trip, and it's never seemed frequent or easy to use. Our State of the System report shows that a large area in the core of the system has underlying demand for service that runs every 15 minutes or better. This scenario addresses that by providing all-day frequent service in those areas. Metro frequency provides frequent service, like I said, where ridership and demand support it. So that means that we have reliable, frequent service in the core and frequent service in both directions all day in the inner parts of the system. This does mean, though, that we have less frequent service in the outer parts of the system, and we don't operate off-peak express service, so midday travel times are not as competitive with driving. And so in these next diagrams, you can see how that service looks, right? So with local service at rush hour, we've got subway-like service, 15 minutes all day, every day, both directions. And the express service has limited stops heading into Center City for quicker trips and no off-peak. Now, when we look at fares, we have better integration and transfers with other modes, particularly in the parts of the network we were showing in that red line, the 15-minute service to bus and SEPTA Metro. And going back to those trips with Brenda, Fred, and Isabella, Brenda can treat regional rail like subway-style transit in scenario 2. She can just walk up to the station and know that a train will be along soon. However, Fred has the same trip that he had in scenario 1. So we're setting up these decisions because some people's trips don't vary that much between scenarios, while other people's types of trips will change a lot between scenarios. And that is exemplified with Isabella's. You know, she's living in Paoli and works the midday shift at University City. In this scenario, she has a train every 60 minutes, but since she's not traveling at peak, she has to transfer at Radnor. And so as you can see here, the 3 different types of trips we're showing are quite different in scenario 2 and scenario 1. And we'll head into scenario 3.
Great. And now imagine you're in Trenton. It's the middle of the day and you're in luck because there are 2 trains at the station. One, the SEPTA Regional Rail service takes your SEPTA ticket, but it takes almost an hour to get into Center City. The other train is an Amtrak train, and it's a straight shot, almost half the travel time, but you can't take it because your SEPTA ticket won't work on it. Scenario 3 helps make this trip easier. We call Scenario 3 all-day speed. Scenario 3 integrates services across providers within the regional rail service area, and this can save time. This map shows the travel time savings to key stations throughout the network, and you can see that travel time savings vary by line, with some shorter lines and interstations seeing similar travel times as today, and other stations seeing savings of 6, 10, 15, even 20 minutes of travel time savings over what is seen today. This means some stations have frequent express service to Center City all day, and it minimizes the duplicative rail service operated by different service providers. The trade-off is that the rest of the system outside the express stations sees less frequent service. These line diagrams shows what that looks like. Local service looks the same at rush hour as it does the rest of the day. Express service does as well. A highlight of this scenario is that it integrates fares and transfers better with different service providers. That SEPTA ticket at Trenton gets you on either train, as long as you're within the SEPTA Regional Rail Service area. So how does this work for our personas? Well, Brenda gets on at Overbrook and travels to Ardmore, and her station is not a key station. It doesn't receive express service. So the train comes once an hour, and for Brenda, it makes sense to take the bus instead. Fred, however, gets on at Thorndale, and he rides into Center City. His station gets express service. Scenario 3 works really well for him. Isabella also has express service that runs every 30 minutes that connects her directly to the Penn Medicine station from Paoli. And now, the different service patterns in the scenarios also change other things like stations and platforms, train equipment, and fares. Now, there are some other things that are part of the network that need to be taken into consideration. Scenario 2, for example, we assume has specific branding to its vehicles and high platform stations that have level boarding for the metro frequency parts of the system. And this is not the case for scenarios 1 and 3. We are looking at, either high platforms or low level platforms with mini highs for accessibility. On the next slide, you see but you can see this on the vehicles themselves as well. The traditional fleet has more seats for long rides. It has steps and a trap door for low-level platforms, and one door on the end of each car. Now, for the metro frequency stations in scenario 2, we envision a different fleet, which has more doors, level boarding for quicker stop dwell times, and less seating, which gives more room for luggage, bikes, and people. And the fare structure we've assumed is a bit different as well, with flatter zone structures that are better integrated with other SEPTA modes, and in the case of scenario 3, better integrated with other service providers as well.
All of the scenarios involve trade-offs. They are good and don't perform quite as well at different things. In order to figure out where each scenario is shown, we evaluated the scenarios in relation to our project goals using key performance metrics such as ridership, access, service patterns, and cost. We ultimately want regional rail to be able to increase and improve access to opportunities, prioritize an intuitive rider experience through a seamless, welcoming system, and create a reliable, predictable regional rail system that people can trust. All our scenarios offer improvements when we compare it to the existing system. Like I said earlier today, the system focuses on getting folks into Center City who work 9 to 5 jobs and often leaves communities of color and low-income folks behind. Every scenario increases the share of minority, low-income, and residents who don't own a car who ride the system. All the scenarios also reduce the amount of vehicle miles traveled and increase access to destinations, not just in Center City, but across the system. They also make transit faster in general for the region, offer better accessibility due to the types of platforms, and increase ADA access. They improve reliability, and they're also easier to understand than the regional rail system is today. Each scenario provides more riders, more service than the current regional rail system does. Total increase in ridership. So we see the highest increase in scenario 2 that has the metro frequency, the second highest in scenario 1, which has the regional coverage, and scenario 3 does have the lowest increase in ridership, but all of them are a huge increase over the existing system. Each scenario provides more service where demand justifies it. Much of it that is within the city of Philadelphia. So scenario 1 and scenario 3 offer modest increases in the populations that are within a 15-minute walk of frequent service, while scenario 2 really shines in offering folks access to frequent service, and all are an increase over the existing system. Each scenario reduces the cost burden, especially for low-income communities. Teresa earlier was talking about the fare structure. That fare structure really decreases the cost over the existing regional rail system, and it especially does in the low-income communities within the city of Philadelphia, which is why scenario 2 has the biggest increase in lowering that cost burden for low-income communities. Scenario 1 shines in increasing ridership, but performs poorly in most other metrics. It does constitute an over doubling of the current system ridership, and it also has the highest vehicle mile travel reduction. That's because it focuses on serving regional trips, so it's replacing car trips that are long and reducing folks who are driving those trips. It also does well at access mode being transit, so people aren't, driving and parking; they're riding transit much more often to get in scenario 1. However, the trade-offs: scenario 1 performs poorly on improving destinations access for shorter trips, so within 30 minutes, focusing more on these longer trips. It creates the least amount of frequent transit connections to SEPTA Metro, so it doesn't integrate as well with the other parts of the system. It performs worse on improving service reliability, and it doesn't perform well in increasing the population that has access to frequent service. Scenario 2 sees the biggest increase in ridership and performs best in almost every metric. However, this comes at the highest cost to operate. Scenario 2 well over doubles current ridership. It also has the biggest increase in proportion of riders from equity communities, especially within the city of Philadelphia. It also increases access to destination within 30 minutes, meaning that a short trip on regional rail can get you to many different places in this scenario. It also offers a service that is most time competitive with driving. It has the most transfers from frequent service to frequent bus and metro, creating a more integrated SEPTA lifestyle system. It has the biggest accessibility improvements, very much due to those high-level platforms, and it has the highest population served by frequent service. There are a couple trade-offs, which is it does not decrease vehicles mile traveled as much because it is mostly replacing shorter trips within the city, and it is the most expensive to operate. Scenario 3 has the lowest ridership of the scenarios, but performs well in many of the metrics and for the lowest cost. It also has a large VMT decrease because it's focusing on replacing many of those long distance trips very quickly. It does have an increase in frequent connections to frequent bus and metro. The service reliability is improved. It's easy to understand. There's a least amount of service patterns. So it takes, very legible to understand when your train is coming and where it's going. And it does also increase the population with access to frequent service and access to destinations within 30 minutes. Where scenario 3 doesn't do as well, least amount of ridership, least amount of service provided, and least time competitive with driving.
So we want to hear from you on this. As we've talked about these scenarios, what's most important to you? Trains arriving every 30 minutes across the entire system, trains coming every 15 minutes or more where ridership and demand support it, but less frequent elsewhere, or having express trains that make trips fast by visiting a limited number of stations. These are the trade-offs we're looking at, so we're very interested in what you're thinking here. Madeline, I think you can close the poll when you think we've gotten a lot of answers. Interesting. Yeah. We've got more than twice as many people for scenario 2 compared to scenario 1, and very few people preferring scenario 3. These are exactly the kind of choices we need to make here, because ultimately we can't do all of the above. And this is also what you can tell us in the online web tool, which we've already been getting lots of responses on. In addition to the basic scenario decisions, there are other choices we are making as well, and we think they're important to mention here. There are some opportunities to expand this network. SEPTA owns tracks that could be reactivated. However, in all of those cases, there's a significant amount of money required to do that, where tracks are not currently active, or even where tracks are currently active and have Amtrak service. Those are operating hours and operating dollars that aren't spent elsewhere. So expansion is inherently another kind of trade-off. And one of the questions is, should we be focusing on making service better on the current network, or should we be focusing on expanding to serve more areas? There are also opportunities to serve areas that are along the way but are not served right now. As you can see on this map, there are several lengthy segments of track in the core of the system that have no stations on them. In some cases, they formerly had stations, which were abandoned as the railroads which operated the system really did not want to serve shorter distance trips. But if you look around those segments, there's a lot of demand there. There's a lot of residents who could benefit from that. And there's also a lot of potential to connect to bus routes. And so there might be a good case for adding some stations in those areas. We also have opportunities to add more connections. There are some SEPTA Metro connections that we've built into all of the scenarios. That includes a new North Philadelphia station that has platforms for all of the regional rail lines, both the ones that go under as well as the ones above, making easy transfers between the two halves of the system possible, speeding up a lot of trips, with an improved connection to the Broad Street line, which is right next door. We're also proposing a new station for transfers between the Norristown high-speed line and regional rail at Radnor. Both systems currently have stations there, but they're a long walk apart, as well as two trolley extensions, the Route 10 being extended to Overbrook and the Route 36 being extended to Eastwick. Both of those extensions would be part of the trolley modernization project. So let's hear from you on this as well and put up a poll about these. How would you prioritize these different things? How important is it to extend regional rail to suburban areas that do not currently have service? How important is it to add new stations to serve more people, which might slow down trips slightly for others? And how important is it to add new connections to SEPTA Metro?
Lots of responses coming in. Just going to give it a couple more seconds.
This one takes a little longer since there's 3 questions.
Okay, it's slowing down. I'm going to end it and share out.
So if we look at the first question, extending to suburban areas that do not currently have service, we have 51% saying it's somewhat or very important, and the rest saying it's neutral or not important. Adding new stations to serve more people, we're looking at over 70% saying that's important or somewhat important. So definitely seeing more support for that than for the expansion. And then adding new connections to SEPTA Metro, we're seeing overwhelming support for that in this particular survey, right around 90% saying that's important or somewhat important. Obviously, this is just the attendees of this webinar, which is why we want your comments online to get a lot more people. But again, it's interesting to see even just among tonight's attendees, sort of the range in answers we're seeing there. Okay. So these results will contribute to the process of creating that final recommendation and all of the public input we get. And like I said, the vision for regional rail could be a combination of all of these scenarios with different trade-off decisions on different lines. This is a service-first process. We decided the best way to have this discussion is to talk about what kind of service we can provide. But all of these scenarios require significant capital projects. We're looking at high-level platforms, particularly in scenario 2. We're looking at making all of the stations accessible. We're looking at places where we need full station reconstructions. In some cases, like North Philadelphia, that's to create new connections. In other cases, it's to create capacity, places where stations are currently acting as bottlenecks or places where we need to create transfer points between express and local service. We're going to need new yards because the existing yards are actually a significant bottleneck on the system. We're going to need junction improvements because in some cases, those junctions are limiting the amount of trains we can operate. We're going to need turnback facilities wherever there's a spot where service frequency gets less. And especially in scenario 1, we're going to need some significant amounts of double tracking to allow more frequent service than operates today. Laying this out, it becomes obvious that this can't all be done at once. And it is also important to note that all of these will have to be evaluated compared to other SEPTA projects. And the question has to be asked whether these projects are the best uses of capital dollars. This is why we think looking at ridership is so important, because we think the case gets a lot stronger if we can design a system that carries a lot more people. What ends up happening here is that there are some things which we can implement in the near term. We can make some schedule changes that are possible with the existing infrastructure. The SEPTA team's already done some of that. You'll notice clock face headways on some lines have been put in place over the last couple of years. We can also do some things like changing fare policies to make some of those transfers easier. The other thing is there's projects which are already lined up for this system. And here's a chance to think about those projects that are already in the capital plan and see what opportunities there are to put in place measures that will allow this future service. In the medium term, we're looking at new equipment. And one of the key decisions here is what that equipment looks like. Some station upgrades, some infrastructure upgrades, and both of those then allowing an increase in service. But the full maps that you see here, we're talking about something which is a long way out. We're saying 10 plus years here, but this could be a 30 or 40-year project to ultimately arrive at the maps we're showing you here today. But we think it's really important to have that long-term vision to know where we're going, as well as to have a pragmatic set of near-term implementation projects so that we can actually make the system better in the short term. And with that, we're going to Q&A. So if you have a question, please type your question in the chat, and we will be answering questions that are typed in the chat. With that, I hand it back to Ryan.
Thanks, Christoph. It seems like most people have figured out the Q&A feature. We got a lot of good comments in there. So we're going to go through, there's a couple kind of themes in these comments. We'll try and address them by that topic, and I'll do my best to organize them as we go through this process. The first one I'm going to start with is kind of the selection process. We wrote out 3 scenarios, and they help us understand trade-offs. I think what we could have been clear when we put this information out there is that this won't be a one or the other. It'll be eventually a hybrid that takes what we like about each of these scenarios and pulls them together as best as we can. Obviously, we can't have everything for all of these scenarios. That's why we're having this trade-off discussion. But we really like the opportunity to get the feedback on what you like about each of these scenarios, what you think just doesn't quite work on some of these scenarios. And that allows us to go back to the drawing board, create a hybrid that pulls all of that information together, and then come back to you in the fall to make sure that we heard it all correctly. There were a couple of comments about integration with Amtrak, for example, whether that could happen in any scenario, or certain types of travel times with express patterns, if that could happen in any scenario. And generally speaking, yeah, a lot of those could be scenario agnostic. They could happen in any of those situations. And that's the type of feedback that's really helpful for us. You say that this should happen regardless of which scenario we pick. It helps us understand that that's important, that that's a priority for us as a region. That's something that we should be looking to incorporate into the next step. Christoph, is there anything that you or Teresa want to add on that front?
No, I think that's absolutely right.
Okay. So there were a couple other questions about the demand for service and how that was measured and where some of the endpoints were picked. So Christoph and Teresa, I think that if you can explain some of the transit demand mapping that was done that takes the composite of job density and population density to help figure out beyond just ridership that has been there in the past, what we see as latent demand and how that drives some of these decision makings. I think there is a couple specific questions about the Chestnut Hill West versus East discussion, as well as Radnor versus Paoli for the end of line on Paoli Thorndale line.
Yeah, so what you're seeing on this map is actually the analysis that Teresa's team did on transit demand. And this, in laying out which parts of scenario 2 got frequent service, that was the first consideration. Serve those areas where we see all-day demand. And that includes large chunks of the city of Philadelphia, but it also includes other places like Chester and Norristown. And you can see those places served here. The second consideration we had is that on some lines, it doesn't make sense to arbitrarily end service. On Media Elwyn, for example, if we followed that methodology, you'd end the frequent service 3 stops before the end of the line, and that did not seem like a easy to use system, so we did not do that. Finally, as noted, the 3 scenarios are intended to be roughly equal in total operating hours. That was actually set by scenario 1 because it's got the simplest definition, because it's literally 30 minutes everywhere. And that limited the number of lines which we could include frequent service on in scenario 2, because again, we're setting up a choice and showing the trade-offs here. And that in particular meant that we did not include any of the Trenton line, even though that has some real demand showing up here. We also did not include Fox Chase for the same reason. In a final plan, those lines may be included. Again, we're doing this in order to set up choices. In terms of Chestnut Hill, it seems hard to justify running frequent service on both of those lines, given how close they are together. Chestnut Hill East has somewhat better connections to the trunk of the system. It does not have the same bottleneck as Chestnut Hill West does. And it serves some of the highest density and highest demand better on the inner end of the line than Chestnut Hill West does. So that was the decision between those two. As to where the line ends on the way out to Paoli, there is a real drop-off in demand on the way to Paoli, both in terms of the amount of employment and the amount of people. So we tried to pick a reasonable cutoff spot, and Radnor seems reasonable because in all of the scenarios, we are building a new station there, and that new station could involve the crossovers and the pocket tracks in order to be able to turn around service there, which made that seem like a reasonable point to end, as well as the fact that it adds another SEPTA Metro connection. I'll say these are the kind of things we very much would love to see comments on in the online comment form. We're in no way saying we got this right. We're saying this is something for everybody to react to.
And I can just talk a little bit to the ridership estimation piece of it. So Ryan's absolutely correct. We start with the land uses and we start with the employment density and the population density in the region that we have at a pretty good geographic scale. We did system-wide ridership estimation using what's called simplified trips on project software, or STOPS. This is really helpful for us. We plugged in what the operating plans look like for each of the 3 scenarios. What does the service look like at a station level, at a line level, and at a system-wide level? The outputs from that process are really helpful. What we reported out on tonight is looking at overall system ridership, but we also have that information at a line level and at a stop level. We have it by time of day, and we have sociodemographic factor information associated with that ridership. So it's really helpful for us in looking at how are we really serving the system.
We had a couple of questions while we're on scenario 2 on the screen, Christoph. I think if you can explain the concept behind the kind of midday transfer that shows up in scenario 2. We've gotten a lot of feedback on this, both today in the Q&A as well as over the last week or so since these went live online. I think that's something we're going to be looking a lot closer at as we create a hybrid of these scenarios. That forced transfer doesn't seem like it'll work for a lot of people because of the logistics and transferring and the timing of that. But it would be helpful if you explain the thought process behind why that shows up here.
Yeah, no, and we knew this was a provocative idea when we put it in there. That said, I think we can make a good case for it. It is not the only way to operate frequent service, but we think it's one interesting way to do it. The core of the idea of scenario 2 is that these red lines, this frequent service, is really seen by riders as something that resembles a subway and does not resemble regional rail. And in terms of branding, we think it would actually be considered part of the SEPTA metro system, not the SEPTA regional rail system. So that it would be something like the Market Frankfurt line or the trolleys or the Norristown High Speed line, and would be treated as such on maps and wayfinding and everywhere else. Part of that is we have to make the system really easy to understand. And the difficulty in changing frequency down the line is you can absolutely do that by, say, running a train every 30 minutes to Thorndale and running a train every 30 minutes to Radnor, and they overlap on that core segment and become the 15-minute service. From a rider perspective, though, that service is more difficult to understand because you're getting on a mix of trains with different destinations. And from a branding standpoint, it also means you're taking this brand that is supposed to represent 15-minute frequent service, except parts of it actually represent 30-minute service. And what we've looked at in places like London, for example, is having a brand that is clearly synonymous with high frequency really does make a difference in terms of ridership. So we think that there is a real advantage to having a specific set of lines with a specific branding and a specific set of equipment that can clearly be branded as frequent. Problem is, if you do that on lines that go much further out than we can justify frequent service, you end up with this trade-off. So for Norristown, for example, this is straightforward. All the trains run out to Norristown, but it does not make sense to run 15-minute service out to Thorndale. When we look at ridership demand, those outer segments tend to have the strongest demand during commute hours and much less of the all-day demand. So what we said is, we can run those outer segments as a regional rail service, which during rush hour runs express to Center City. So you get on a trail at Thorndale, it makes every stop to Radnor, and then runs express to Center City all the way in. The vast majority of the riders on that outer segment will be taking that express service and will have a much faster trip. During off-peak hours, that outer segment becomes a shuttle train with a timed transfer at Radnor to transfer to the inner service. That's a relatively small amount of riders who are actually doing that transfer. It also lets us run shorter trains on that outer end. But for the most part, most of those riders on that outer end will actually be experiencing that express service to Center City. And again, if we tried integrating the two services, what you'd end up with is an outer segment that has different service patterns at different times of day, which could also be harder to understand. So that is why this is set up that way. As you see in scenario 1, it is entirely possible to create frequent service by overlapping other services. And it may be that that's the best way to do it, as opposed to this clearly branded separate network. But again, that's part of the kind of reactions we want from you.
We got a number of questions about the types or specifics for the capital projects that would be necessary for this sort of, any of these scenarios, frankly. And Christoph, if you want to take an answer to that, I can provide some general background on that. I think our plan to date, the way we've approached it, is looking at a high level what sort of capital projects would be necessary to enable some of these services over time for each scenario. But we haven't driven down into the details of specific capital projects or priority in terms of implementation just yet. We've been saving that effort for the next phase after we create a hybrid of these scenarios as we move forward.
Yeah. So I mean, one principle which we're following here is what the Germans would say is organization before electronics before concrete. That we're not starting from a starting point of we want to build as much infrastructure as possible. We're starting from a starting point of we want to operate service and build as much infrastructure as we need to build to do that. That said, there are some places where we absolutely need the infrastructure. We have single track segments right now which cannot support 30-minute two-way service. The single track segments are simply too long. And likewise, there are some junctions on the system where either the number of SEPTA trains moving through means that a single delayed train causes a cascading delay across multiple lines, or junctions where SEPTA joins Amtrak lines, and you can never coordinate SEPTA schedules with Amtrak schedules quite as well as SEPTA can coordinate with itself. And just beyond that, you are having very different kinds of services who have to meet. This is definitely happening, for example, on the trains out to Wilmington, as well as on the trains out to Trenton. And looking at ways to add infrastructure to reduce those conflicts, I think has to be part of this as well. It's also really important to think about stations. If you look at the travel times and reliability, stations are a big part of it. If you have stations without level boarding, simply the time it takes people to get on and off the train slows down that schedule meaningfully. If you have stations where people have to board across one track to get to a train on the other track, not only is that problematic for the passengers, it reduces capacity because we have to hold trains on that other track while that boarding is happening. And we have cases where we have stations that don't have platforms on all tracks. Wayne Junction is one of them. And that means you end up essentially creating another kind of bottleneck there. So adding that additional platform would add more capacity through that station. So that is the kind of work we know we need to do here. Now, the attitude here isn't to say we can't do anything until we do that work. The attitude here is to say, what is the best we can do with today's infrastructure through smart scheduling? And then what can we add in little increments using projects that are already programmed to do better than that? Because it doesn't make sense to say, sorry, you got to wait 40 years to have frequent service. Let's see where we can put it in place today, and then see how we can build that system over time.
I know we're a little past time already, but there were a couple questions about coordination with bus revolution as we go through this process as well, and the potential for rerouting some of the bus routes to the regional rail system. We're looking at that in a couple different phases, frankly. The bus revolution implementation timeline and horizon is much shorter by comparison to this project. While we are looking at short-term policy and service changes that we can make as a part of this system, the opportunities to truly integrate them often rely on the ability to provide fully accessible transfer points at stations and facilities. So by integrating the bus network redesign process with this planning process, what it allows us to do is look at the opportunities that the bus network presents so we can prioritize regional rail stations and facilities that may make a lot of sense for a potential end-of-line facility where our bus transfer point can be integrated with a SEPTA station that we own and provide a really good connection of service and seamless transfer opportunity for people using these services. It also relies on better fare integration, which we're looking at as a part of SEPTA Key right now, how we can make policy choices that better integrate our services and allow people to take full advantage of the full breadth and reach of this network. There's another couple questions about Silverliner 6 procurement and the new fleets for regional rail. So we have not made a specific determination about what the Silverliner 6 will look like. We do have some commitment in our capital budget in the outer years to replace the Silverliner 4s as they are older, as Christoph mentioned, and a huge chunk of our fleet. It presents a real opportunity for us to present a vision from this plan that informs the Silverliner 6 type of vehicle and the specifications that we put out on the market based on peer review and what our international peers are doing to provide this type of service. But as Christoph mentioned, by starting the discussion and going through the process with a service first mindset, we're making a decision that's informed by the end goal and the service that we are trying to operate, not just what our current infrastructure can handle or what we think we should get. So all of that is to say all of these efforts are being integrated and they're happening at the same time very intentionally. It's a lot of work for everyone involved. And I know we're throwing a lot out at people to provide feedback on, and it's like oftentimes drinking from a hose. But all that feedback helps us get on the same page internally and make sure that we're building towards something that's bigger than and greater than the sum of the parts. And that ultimately that's how we'll transform our transit system for the 21st century. So with that, I think Christoph, if you want to go to the last slide, we'll kind of wrap it up at this point. We do have an open house that'll be at Jefferson Station next Wednesday in the afternoon. You can check out our website, regionalrailplan.com, for more information on that. We'll also have some pop-up events trying to spread the word that morning in some of the stations. I know there are a lot of questions that we did not get to. We're updating the FAQs on our website right now. that takes into account what we've heard over the past few days from people reaching out about questions with the scenarios. We'll also add in all the themes and questions that we heard through this and talk through what to expect during the next steps of this process as we move forward. With that, thanks for joining tonight. We appreciate all your time. Please make sure to share the word and take the survey if you haven't already. Thanks.